fence, just over 5,600 k's long. It starts at Yalada on the west coast of South Australia and finishes at a little spot called Jandowae, just north of Kingaroy in Queensland.
Australia is home to a structure so vast it can be seen from space. It slices through the red dust for a distance longer than the width of the Atlantic Ocean. This was the ultimate gamble for a nation that was running out of time and options. Thousands of men were sent into the heat to build a wall against an enemy that did not use guns or bombs. Was this the greatest engineering triumph in history, or did the invasion succeed despite all the effort? The Christmas Eve mistake, 1859. In 1859, there was a man called Thomas Austin who was living the dream on a massive piece of land in Australia called Barwon Park. He had money and space, and his hobby was hunting. But there was one big problem. Australia didn't have the kind of animals he liked to shoot. He missed the rabbits from back home in England. So, on Christmas Eve, he had a bright idea that would change the world forever. He asked his nephew to send him some rabbits from Europe.
It all started on Christmas Day 1859 when Thomas Austin, a wealthy English settler, received a shipment of 24 wild rabbits from his brother in England. Thomas loved to hunt, so the rabbits were meant to be his targets and trophies later.
He got 24 of them. Some were wild, and some were the kind you keep as pets. He let them loose on his property, thinking it would be a fun way to spend a Saturday afternoon. He even said that letting a few rabbits go could do little harm and might provide a touch of home. But Thomas was wrong. He was so wrong that it almost broke a whole country. See, those 24 rabbits were not just any rabbits. Because they were a mix of wild and tame, they were like super rabbits. They were tough and fast, and they really liked to have babies. In the English woods, foxes and owls kept rabbit numbers low. But in Australia, there was nothing to stop them. No big predators were waiting in the grass, and the weather was warm all year round. It was like a giant party with an open buffet of green grass. Within just 6 years, Thomas had so many rabbits on his land that he killed 20,000 of them just to try and clear some space. But it didn't matter. For every one he shot, a dozen more were born. They started hopping away from his fence and into the rest of the country. And they moved fast, too. They spread out at a rate of about 100 kilometers every single year. This was the fastest takeover by any mammal in history. All of a sudden, it wasn't just a few bunnies in a garden anymore. It had become an army of millions. And they were hungry. They ate the grass and even ate the bark off the trees until the trees died. By the time the government realized what was happening, the map of Australia was starting to turn into a giant, dusty wasteland. But as bad as the hunger was, the real nightmare was about to begin. A continent stripped bare. The gray wave reached its peak in the late 1880s, and the sheer scale of the destruction is hard to believe. In the state of New South Wales alone, the rabbit population exploded to an estimated 60 million within a few decades. These animals were eating about as much grass as 10 million sheep. This created a huge problem because the Australian wool industry was the backbone of the entire economy. By 1887, officials recorded that rabbits had destroyed over 40,000 square kilometers of land. That is an area larger than the entire country of Belgium, turned into a wasteland in just a few years. The rabbits did not just eat the grass on the surface, they were survival experts. So when the easy food ran out, they used their claws to dig up the literal roots of the plants. This is what caused the permanent damage. Without roots to hold the dirt in place, the topsoil became loose and dry. In 1894, massive dust storms started to hit the region. One specific storm was so big that it carried red outback dust all the way to the coast of New Zealand, which is over 2,000 kilometers away across the ocean. The land was literally blowing away because the rabbits had stripped it bare. Farmers tried to fight back with every tool they had. They spent over £15 million in today's money on bounty programs. In a single year, one station in Victoria reported killing 25,000 rabbits every single week. But the numbers never went down. The rabbits were breeding so fast that a single pair could theoretically produce over 300 descendants in one season. It was obvious that biology itself was working against the humans. And because the rabbits ate the seedlings of native trees like the mulga and the saltbush, those trees stopped growing. This changed the entire look of the Australian wilds forever. The financial hit was so brutal. In some parts of the country, the value of the land dropped by 70% because it could no longer support livestock. Sheep started dying by the millions because they simply could not compete with the rabbits for food. On one famous sheep station called Muturu, the sheep population fell from 100,000 head down to just 30,000 in a very short time. Families who had been wealthy for generations lost everything. They were forced to leave their homes because the rabbits had eaten their bank accounts and their futures. As the 1890s came to an end, the rabbits reached the edge of the Nullarbor Plain, which was the gateway to Western Australia. If the rabbits crossed this dry, empty space, they would hit the massive wheat belts on the other side. The government realized that individual farmers could not win this fight alone. They needed a massive, government-funded wall. The 1,800-kilometer gamble. By 1901, the government of Western Australia realized that the rabbits were marching toward their most valuable wheat fields. To stop them, they came up with a plan that sounded impossible at the time. They decided to build a fence that would cut the entire state in half from north to south. This project became known as the #1 rabbit-proof fence. When it was finished, it stretched 1,833 kilometers. That is over 1,100 miles of wire and wood, cutting through some of the hottest and driest places on the planet. To this day, it remains one of the longest unbroken fences ever built by humans. Building a fence of this size in the early 1900s was a nightmare for the workers. There were no trucks or heavy machinery, and everything had to be done by hand or with animals. The government hired 120 men and divided them into teams. These men had to clear a path through thick scrub and heavy timber. They used axes and cross-cut saws to chop down enough trees to make fence posts. For the areas where there were no trees, they had to haul in heavy iron posts from hundreds of kilometers away. The logistics were pretty crazy. To keep the project moving, the teams used 350 camels, 210 horses, and 41 donkeys. These animals carried rolls of wire, tools, and enough water to keep the men alive in the 45-degree heat. The workers faced dust storms that could strip the skin off their faces and swarms of flies so thick they couldn't see the person standing next to them. They were often working hundreds of kilometers away from the nearest town. If someone got sick or hurt, there was no quick way to get help. The fence itself was a serious piece of engineering for its time. It stood about 1.1 meters high, which is roughly 3.5 feet. The workers used a specific type of wire mesh, with holes small enough that a young rabbit couldn't squeeze through. Aware of the rabbit's penchant for digging, they didn't simply rest the fence on the surface. Instead, they anchored the wire 15 centimeters deep into the earth. To make it even tougher, they added 3 strands of plain wire and 1 strand of barbed wire at the top to stop larger animals from jumping over it or leaning on it. The total cost of the project was about £80,000 back then. In today's money, that is worth around $10 million. For a young colony with a small population, this was a massive amount of money to spend on a single wall. They even built 100 small gates along the line so that travelers and livestock could cross. But the rules were strict. If you left a gate open, you could go to jail. By the time the #1 fence was nearing completion in 1907, the workers had used over 8,000 tons of materials. They had conquered deserts, crossed salt lakes, and pushed through dense forests. It was a giant achievement of human willpower, and clearly showed just how much the government feared the rabbit invasion. But long before they finished constructing this first fence, the builders found out that the rabbits had outsmarted them. The flaw in the wire. The construction of the #1 rabbit-proof fence was supposed to be a triumph, but by 1902, it turned into a massive tactical blunder. While the government was still pouring money into the northern sections of the wire, a boundary rider made a horrifying discovery. He found tracks and burrows nearly 100 kilometers to the west of the construction line. The rabbits had outpaced the workers and didn't wait for the fence to be finished. They simply hopped through the wide open gaps in the desert before the posts were even in the ground. So, what they were trying to keep out was already on the wrong side of the fence. This forced the government into a humiliating strategic retreat. Instead of stopping, they decided to build a second and then a third line of defense. Fence number 2 was built 120 kilometers to the west of the first one, stretching for 1,160 kilometers. Then they built fence number 3 to run toward the coast. The map of Western Australia began to look like a giant bullseye. They were trying to create a tiered defense system to trap the rabbits that had already slipped through. By 1907, they had laid down a total of 3,256 kilometers of wire, creating the longest fence system in the world at the time. The building process for these extra fences was a massive engineering feat. Because the first fence failed so quickly, the government got much stricter with the specs for fence numbers 2 and 3. They used a specific A-grade wire mesh with a 42-millimeter weave. This was small enough that even a baby rabbit couldn't squeeze its head through. The posts were made of split jarrah wood or iron star pickets spaced exactly 3.7 meters apart. Every single post had to be bored by hand to thread the straining wires through. If a post was even slightly loose, the tension of the wire would pull it out of the ground, creating a gap. Back then, humans didn't have drones, poisons that targeted specific species, or advanced biology. A simple physical wall was the only technology they understood. They truly believed they could outbuild a biological explosion with hammers and nails. It was a war of hardware against high-speed breeding. For every kilometer the men built, the rabbits were born by the thousands on the other side. This was decades before the invention of biological warfare like the myxoma virus, so the fence was the only shield the farmers had. The cost of this retreat was staggering. The government had to pass the 1905 Vermin Act just to manage the legal mess. This law made it a crime to have a pet rabbit, and it gave the government the power to force farmers to build their own smaller fences to connect to the main line. The state was literally going broke trying to keep up with a plague that was already moving faster than any horse or camel could carry a roll of wire. The Dingo War. By the 1920s, the people living in the outback realized they had a much bigger problem than a few billion bunnies. Rabbits were eating the grass, but something else was eating the profits. Dingoes, Australia's wild golden-colored dogs, had discovered a new favorite snack: sheep. To a dingo, a fenced-in paddock full of sheep was like an all-you-can-eat buffet that didn't run away. A single dingo could kill dozens of sheep in a single night, often not even for food, but just out of a hunting instinct. For a farmer with a flock of 5,000 sheep, a small pack of dingoes was a financial death sentence. The sheep industry was the lifeblood of the country, so the government decided to get aggressive. And to do so, they needed to build a fortress. They started connecting different states' fences to create one giant, unbroken line. This became the Great Dingo Fence. At its absolute peak, this thing was a monster. It stretched for 5,614 kilometers. To put that in perspective, if you took that fence and laid it across the United States, it would start in New York City, go all the way to Los Angeles, and then turn around and go halfway back to Chicago.
It's the world's longest fence, extending more than 5,000 kilometres from the Great Australian Bight to Queensland's Darling Downs.
The construction of the dingo fence was a huge step up from the rabbit fences. Dingoes are smart, strong, and they can jump. A flimsy little wire mesh wasn't going to cut it. The new fence had to be much taller, reaching up to 1.8 meters high. That is nearly 6 feet of steel and wire. The workers used heavy timber posts or steel star pickets to keep the wire tight. They used a heavy-duty hexagonal mesh at the bottom, because dingoes will try to bite and tear their way through. To keep them from digging under, the workers laid a foot of mesh flat on the ground and buried it with rocks and dirt. This is called a foot net, and it is a nightmare to install in the hard, sun-baked clay of the desert. The cost was astronomical, but the government didn't have a choice. In the 30s and 40s, The dingoes were winning. They were pushing the sheep line further and further south, forcing farmers to switch to cattle, which are bigger and can defend themselves better. The dingo fence was the final stand for the Australian wool industry. It was a literal line in the sand. On one side, the wild dogs could roam free, and on the other side, they were hunted on sight. Once the fence was closed, the interior of the country was effectively split in half. But keeping a 5,000-kilometer wire wall standing in the middle of a desert is basically an impossible task. The desert doesn't like things standing in its way. Between the shifting sand dunes that could swallow a fence overnight and the wild camels that would simply walk through it like it was made of paper, the humans were about to find out just how hard it is to maintain a border that long. The boundary riders. Once the fences were built, the government faced a new problem. A fence in the middle of a desert does not stay standing on its own. To keep the rabbits out, they created one of the loneliest jobs in human history: the boundary rider. These men were hired to live on the fence line, and their only task was to make sure not a single hole existed in the wire. Each rider was responsible for a section of the fence that could be up to 160 kilometers long. They spent their entire lives moving back and forth along that line, often not seeing another human being for months at a time. In the early days, these men did not have trucks or even motorcycles. They used camels. Camels were the only animals tough enough to survive the heat and go days without water, while carrying heavy rolls of replacement wire and tools. A rider would load up his camel and start his patrol. He had to inspect every single meter of the mesh. He looked for holes chewed by animals, wires snapped by the heat, or spots where the wind had blown sand over the top. If he found a break, he had to fix it right then and there, often in 40-degree heat with flies swarming his eyes and mouth. The living conditions were brutal. The government built small iron shacks every 30 to 40 kilometers along the fence. These huts were like ovens in the summer and freezing boxes in the winter. Most riders didn't even use them. They just slept on the ground next to their camels. Their diet was mostly flour, salt meat, and tea. Water was the biggest challenge. The government dug wells and built tanks along the fence line. But in a bad drought, these would dry up. A rider who didn't manage his water correctly could die out there, and some did. It wasn't just rabbits and weather they had to worry about too. They had to deal with fence breakers. Emus were a constant problem. A 50-kilogram bird running at full speed doesn't see a thin wire fence until it hits it. These birds would smash through the mesh like a bowling ball, leaving a hole big enough for a car to drive through. There were also the wild camels that would lean their entire weight against the fence to reach a bit of green scrub on the other side, snapping the wooden posts like toothpicks. The boundary riders also had to be unofficial police. Under the law, anyone traveling through the outback had to use the official gates. If a traveler found a gate locked and decided to cut the wire to get their wagon through, the boundary rider had to track them down or report them. Leaving a gate open was a serious crime because it only took a few hours for hundreds of rabbits to pour through. By the 20s, the riders started using bicycles with thick tires to speed up their patrols, and eventually, they moved to stripped-down Model T Fords. But even with engines, the job was the same. The dingo line. The Great Dingo Fence changed the geography of Australia in a permanent way. By the 1940s, the government began linking thousands of kilometers of older rabbit fences together to create one massive, unbroken line. It starts at the cliffs of the Great Australian Bight and snakes all the way to the coast of Queensland. The single goal of this project was to keep dingoes in the wild north and west, leaving the south and east safe for sheep. If you look at Australia from a satellite, you can see the result of this project with your own eyes. A literal green line follows the path of the wire. This happens because the vegetation is completely different on each side of the mesh. On the dingo side, there is more grass, bushes, and trees. On the sheep side, the land often looks like a dusty, brown desert. The fence created a great shift in how the ecosystem works. Scientists call this a trophic cascade. In a normal environment, the dingo is the top predator. Its job is to hunt large animals like kangaroos. When dingoes are present, they keep the kangaroo numbers low. This allows the plants to grow, the seeds to sprout, and the soil to stay healthy. Once the fence was closed and the dingoes were removed from the sheep side, that natural balance was ruined. Without a predator to chase them, the kangaroo population grew to levels that the land could not support. In the areas protected by the fence, millions of kangaroos began to compete with the sheep for every single blade of grass. Because kangaroos can jump and move quickly, they got to the best food first. This led to massive overgrazing. The kangaroos ate the grass down to the dirt and ate the young seedlings before they could ever become trees. The sheep side of the fence looks much more barren from space because of this. The protection of the fence led to the destruction of the very plants the farmers needed for their livestock. The presence of the fence also changed the soil itself. When the kangaroos and sheep eat all the plants, there are no roots left to hold the ground together. The wind picks up the dry dirt and carries it away, leading to permanent erosion. This means that even if you removed the fence today, the land would take decades to recover. The dingo line created two different versions of Australia. One side is a functioning wild ecosystem. The other is a man-made grazing zone that is constantly fighting against turning into a total desert. The shadow predators, cats and foxes. When the dingoes were kicked out of the sheep country, the smaller hunters moved in to take their place. In the wild, dingoes are the bosses. They spend a lot of their time chasing away or killing red foxes and feral cats because they don't want the competition. This keeps the number of smaller killers very low. But once the big 5,614-kilometer fence was closed, the middle-sized predators suddenly had nobody to fear. Scientists call this a mesopredator release. It simply means the cats and foxes were finally free to do whatever they wanted. This created a massive crisis for Australia's native animals. See, the continent has hundreds of tiny creatures like the bilby, the numbat, and different kinds of hopping mice. These animals are only found in Australia. They are small and have no way to defend themselves against a fast cat or a clever fox. Because the dingoes were gone, the cat and fox populations grew to huge numbers on the sheep side of the fence. A single feral cat can kill up to 10 native animals in just one night. When you multiply that by millions of cats, you get a total wipeout. The red fox was especially bad for the ecosystem. These foxes were brought over from Europe a long time ago for hunting, and they loved the new dingo-free zone. They hunted the native animals until some species vanished from the area completely. For example, the greater bilby used to live all over the outback. Now, it only survives in a few spots where dingoes still roam or inside special mini-fences built to keep the cats out. The big fence meant to protect the sheep ended up making the land a playground for these invasive killers. The loss of these small animals changed the soil too. Many of Australia's native mammals are diggers. They spend their nights scratching at the dirt to find seeds and bugs. This digging helps water soak into the ground and helps plants grow. When the foxes and cats killed off the diggers, the ground became hard and dry. The fence that was supposed to save the farms was actually hurting the very earth the farmers stood on. Modern warfare. By the 2010s, the people created a different method of fencing called cluster fencing. Instead of relying on a single state-run wall that is thousands of kilometers away, groups of farmers are teaming up to build their own private fortresses. They pick a group of neighboring properties and wrap one massive, predator-proof fence around the entire perimeter. These are called exclusion cells. Some of these clusters cover over 100,000 hectares of land. It is like building a gated community, but for sheep instead of people.
Its purpose is to keep dingoes out of New South Wales or out of sheep grazing lands. And it's very effective. On this side of the fence, we're able to grow sheep because there's no dingoes to kill the sheep. And on this side of the fence, they mainly grow cattle because cattle can cope with dingoes.
The technology for these fences is much better than it was in the 1900s. Modern farmers use high tensile steel wire that does not sag in the heat. They use apron fencing, which is a heavy mesh that lays flat on the ground, so dingoes and pigs cannot dig under it. Some even use electric wires powered by solar panels to give predators a painful surprise if they try to climb. This new style of modern warfare against pests is working in places where the old fences failed. This change has led to a massive sheep revival in parts of Queensland. For decades, many towns in the outback were dying because dingoes had made sheep farming impossible. Towns like Blackall and Longreach saw their populations shrink as families moved away. They were becoming ghost towns, but once the cluster fences went up, the sheep came back. With the sheep came the shearers, the truck drivers, and the shop owners. In some districts, the number of lambs surviving to adulthood went from 20% up to 90% almost overnight. It is a huge win for the local economy and has put millions of dollars back into small rural communities. Of course, these fences are not cheap. Building a high-quality exclusion fence can cost between $4,000 and $10,000 per kilometer. Because it is so expensive, the way it gets paid for is a mix of different sources. The state and federal governments provide millions of dollars in grants and low-interest loans because they want to save the wool industry. The farmers have to pay for the rest and also take on the permanent job of maintaining the wire. It is a massive private investment in the future of the land. However, cluster fencing is also very controversial. When you fence off a huge block of land, you aren't just keeping dingoes out. You are also trapping native animals like emus and red kangaroos inside. If a drought hits, these animals cannot migrate to find water, and they often die against the wire. Also, when one group of farmers fences their land, the dingoes are pushed onto the neighbor's property that doesn't have a fence yet. This creates a situation where everyone is forced to build a wall just to survive. Australia has spent over 100 years and millions of dollars trying to use wire to control nature. We have seen that while these fences can save an industry, they also change the rules of the wild in ways we still don't fully understand. Share your thoughts with us. Was the cost of thousands of kilometers of wire worth the struggle to save a continent? Since the fence almost failed, can a simple barrier ever truly stop a biological invasion? Leave your answers in the comments below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoy this video, please click on the next one on your screen.